Hi everyone, Professor King here. In this video, I'm going to be talking about Andrea Lunsford's Everything's an Argument, Chapter 11, which talks about causal arguments. So I'll bring it to the share screen here and pull up the PowerPoint. Some of these slides are a little information heavy, so you may want to pause and take down the notes as you go. Because I'm going to go through these not very quickly, but maybe quickly for some of the information that's on some of the slides. So causal arguments. Notice that word causal. It's not casual. It's causal, meaning cause and effect, right? So causal arguments, what they are, what they do is that they inform choices that people make every day. They're at the heart of major policy decisions, both national and international. They exist in many forms, and they frequently appear as part of other arguments. So a lot of times you'll see like an argument of definition, for example, and that argument of definition, how something is defined, will then create a causal argument in that if this thing is defined this way, then what do we do about it? What are the next steps involved, and what can happen because of the implementation of that policy or those steps? Again, cause and effect, right? So if we think back to like arguments of definition, one of the things I talked about is like, trans women, right? People who are transgender. And if we define a woman as someone whose gender identity is woman, regardless of biology at birth, or regardless of sort of genitalia markers or anything like that, then we see that that's going to change how we treat trans women, right? And if you think about the current legislation, this is, we're now in July of 2020. If you think about the current legislation that was just passed that discriminates against people who are transgender in the healthcare industry, doctors can deny service to people based on, personal beliefs, but really the sort of specific target, one of the specific targets for that is people who are transgender. And so if in other words, if I'm a doctor and my argument of definition for a woman is she has to have female genitalia, or she has to have 2X chromosomes, or these very limiting and biologically incorrect sort of markers, right? Then I can say, oh, I'm not going to treat you if you are, if you're a trans woman who hasn't had gender reaffirming surgery yet, or if you are, a trans woman who has an extra Y chromosome or something like that, right? So these are major issues, right? They are a big deal. They have long-lasting and very severe consequences for certain groups. That's just one example, right? But it's an example that we can come back to now that we've talked about a little bit about arguments of definition. So there are three types of causal arguments. The first one is, the clearest one, which is an argument that states a cause and then examines its effects, right? So here's another argument of definition, right? Like, how do we define our immigration policy in this country based on, human rights and our past history, the sort of, national boundaries of this country, and what they have been, what they have not been, et cetera, et cetera. So let's say we start with a cause, right? After that definition, which is, what if immigration reform gave millions of people a legal pathway to citizenship? That would then most likely lead to an effect, right? Which is an increase in economic growth, but that's not the only effect that it could lead to, right? When we think about cause and effect relationships, there are probably multiple effects that could happen from a cause, right? So it's not just increase in economic growth. It could also be less racial hostility. It could be lower prison populations, right? In places like Arizona, where historically for a very long time, had things uh, people had to, were forced to walk around with identity cards or immigration cards to show that they were legal residents. They were documented residents, I should say, of the state and therefore of the country. So, again, if we think about immigration reform and that is our cause, then we can think about multiple effects that it would have. And we could think of even more than this, right? We could think about, especially now, how if we had immigration reform, we might not be, putting people who are of Mexican descent into concentration camps like we're doing in many places in the United States, right? We can think about how we can stop the spread of COVID-19 because we're not putting children who are ripped from their families in those concentration camps, and we're not putting the elderly in those concentration camps, right? Like, so we're creating a healthier space in this country as well, right? So these aren't the only effects. We could think of many more that have to do with the cause of, that respond to the cause of immigration reform. So that's up to you, the writer, when you construct causal arguments in things like proposals, right? In things like arguments that talk about what we should do in the future, right? That's what your job is to see sort of like this cause and what could be the effect. Again, if we think about rhetoric, in a previous video, I talked about how rhetoric, is meant to make the world better. And if we're thinking about how we make the world better, one of the brass tacks ways that we do that is we have to think about cause and effect, right? What we have to do today and the effects that it will have to create a better tomorrow. But we also sometimes can already see the effects since we're living in dynamic, breathing history, living history, right? We can see effects that have already happened and then go back to the cause. Here, I'll move this here. So, and again, it doesn't always have to be these very intense conversations about like immigration or gender identity or things like that. Sometimes it could be like marketing, right? Like, if I was alive at the time when CDs were big, and let's say in the late 90s, early 2000s, I started to see a decline in the sale of CDs. Right now, CD sales are essentially non-existent. Right, they've gone the way of the 8-track and the laser disc and all of those other technological innovations that have gone by the wayside. Right. But let's say I see the effect, which is CDs are, I'm early 2000s Katie, and I'm seeing that CDs are essentially vanishing from the marketplace. There's a major drop in sales of CDs. Well, I, as someone, who's lived through history, can start to consider what were the reasons for this, right? Well, one, the introduction of MP3s, right, and of streaming services. Also, new modes of music distribution, like those streaming services, or preference for single song purchases. That's all kind of what we're seeing today with with the technological innovations that are in place. I could also say, like there was a resurgence in record in selling music on record, right? That sort of analog resurgence that happened as well in the early 2000s. I could come up with wacky reasons, like maybe we wanted to be more environmentally conscious, so we streamed music instead of putting it on these plastic discs, the environmental sort of causes of that, right? So that's where you're already looking at the effect, and then you're going backward to see kind of what caused that thing. So this is more for reflection, right? This is where we reflect on something that's happened and we think about where it came from. All right. And then the third one is arguments that move through a series of links. So if we think about things like syllogism is going to be an incredibly helpful tool in determining arguments that move through a series of links, right? Because if we're capable of that sort of critical thought, of that logical process, then we can start to see not just, step one, step two, but step one, step two, step three, step four, step five, and so on and so forth until we reach, a sort of end conclusion and result that is logical. So the one we see here, right, is if the cause, is that emissions from a Midwestern utility plant cause acid rain, then the next step might be that acid rain causes destruction in eastern forests, which then causes, which then is also impacted by states not having acted to break that cause and effect. Like states aren't doing anything because of cause A to B, right? And all of those combined lead to the effect D, which is that acid rain could destroy most of the eastern forest by 2020, right? Well, we saw that that didn't necessarily happen because we took the steps to intervene, right? We took the steps to make sure that that didn't happen. So that's another thing we have to think about is if I'm making this argument, let's say in 2010, right? And I know that these things could very likely happen. If somebody intervenes, let's say here, right, at the state level and says we have to do more, and we go back to cause A and we tell these Midwestern utility plants, that you have to, that you've got to reduce your emissions, that you've got to find greener ways of operating, then that can change the course of this, and then effect D can change, right? So that's another fascinating thing about causal arguments is, like all arguments, they are dynamic. They can change with time, with place, with action, with intent, all of these sorts of things, right? So if there's an intervention somewhere along this chain, then the effect D will have changed, right? So that's important to note when we're thinking about a link in the chain, right? And just one more thing I want to say about this, if we think about like a current contemporary issue that's going on, we could substitute something else for this, right? So let's say like the murder of George Floyd, right? George Floyd, the citizen who was, killed by a police officer, aided and abetted by 3 other police officers for essentially using a counterfeit $20 bill at a grocery store. So we say the cause A, the sort of catalyzing point is George Floyd being murdered, right? Then cause B is a sort of resurgence, a reinvigoration of Black Lives Matter protests. Then we could have cause C be also the murder of Breonna Taylor at the hands of police, right? Which invigorates even more protests, right? And then we can keep going, right? Which leads to people to call for the dismantling or defunding of police forces as we know them, right? To make them less violent, to put less burden on the part of police officers when responding to calls that have to do more with things like social work, psychological need, class need, right? Housing, things like that. To where we put funding, then the effect could ultimately be that we take some of the funding away from the sort of business industrial model that currently characterizes a lot of police forces and put it toward less militaristic tactics and more toward rehabilitative tactics, right? Like I said, employing more social workers, employing more psychologists, employing, creating more spaces for housing development for the housing insecure, right? Things like that, right? So that's another example of where we could see like a causal argument in play, right? And it's not necessarily that one thing always causes another. Again, you have these other sort of causes and intervening moments happening, and at any point that could change based on action and behavior and things like that. But you start to see how these things are cause and effect relationships. So in terms of characterizing causal arguments, right? First, they're often part of other arguments, especially proposals, right? Again, the whole point of a proposal is to say, you know, and a lot of people in business and marketing majors can understand this, right? Here's your problem, and here's how we get to the solution, right? That's what that is a causal argument, right? They draw on a causal analysis to establish a relationship between A and B, right? The causal analysis provides a rationale that motivates the proposal. All that means is that if I'm an analyst, right, or if I'm a consultant, a business consultant, and I come to you and I say, hey, you know, the way that you're running your business is not working because of these things. And I've analyzed this to show you that that's why this isn't working. But if we intervene and we go this way and we take these steps, then I could increase profitability and keep your business alive and, you know, get you more money and make your business expand and all these sorts of things. So that's how a proposal is like a causal argument, right? Somebody comes in and says, I've done the cause work, now we're going to start working toward the effect work, right? Causal arguments are almost always complex, right? Which makes it difficult to establish cause and effect because, as we saw, again, a lot of times there are multiple causes, there are multiple effects. Some of the causes and effects like kind of link up to work together or affect one another. So keep that in mind, right? It's not usually just like an A to B sort of thing. Whenever possible, to demonstrate convincing causal connections between A and B, we gain important knowledge, we gain powerful arguments, right? So, so you'll see in a lot of like the Black Lives Matter counter protests, the people who are saying like, oh, well, if you defund the police, you know, what's going to happen when, you know, your husband beats you up or something like that? And what's going to happen when you know, someone breaks into your store? Well, then we go back and we say, well, it's not as simple as, you know, when we say defunding the police, we, you know, we don't necessarily mean like not having any sort of infrastructure to maintain a safe society. Like nobody's saying that, right? Nobody's saying like lawless Wild West California or United States. So then we intervene and we say, no, it's more complex than that, right? If we're asking, you know, police officers with, you know, only a limited amount of hours of training before they're, you know, thrown into the field, and then we're expecting them to be social workers, domestic violence advocates, you know, housing experts, crime experts, detectives, you know, any number of these jobs, right? We're asking them to take on all these jobs. Then we can go, okay, the knowledge that we're really trying to gain here is not to say that, you know, just all or nothing, right? It's not an either or argument, but it's more complex. It's saying, why haven't we put more funding toward, you know, rehabilitative measures? Why are we putting so much funding toward punitive measures when the United States already has by far the highest prison population in the country, in the world, and the people who are in prison in our country are overwhelmingly people of color, disproportionately to you know, the actual country's demographics, right? So so it becomes so much more than about like this all or nothing, cops or no cops sort of thing. It becomes about all of these sort of systemic issues that are going on in our country and how they affect multiple lives, right? And how we can change that. So again, that's the reaching of gaining important knowledge, hopefully coming to some sort of consensus, engaging in powerful arguments, et cetera, et cetera. They're also, causal arguments are also, like I already mentioned, definition based, which means they can be confusing. And until you provide a definition for the key terms you're using in that causal claim, you need to proceed cautiously with your argument. Because, you know, if you, I mentioned this example in a previous video, but like if you define life as conception, right, versus someone else who defines life as birth, that's probably going to lead to very different causal arguments about women's reproductive rights, about, you know, things like abortion and birth control and all of that. So if I just say, you know, life, right? Or you know, if I say I'm pro-life, well, what do I mean by that? Am I pro-life for the unborn, but, you know, not for the children who are being put in detainment centers, right? The immigrant children who are being put in detainment centers. Am I pro-life for the unborn, but I'm not pro-life for, you know, people who are being systemically murdered as a result of our systemic inequalities? Then, you know, again, I have to define what I mean by that. And if I don't have a very sound definition, then my argument falls apart. Causal arguments usually yield probable rather than absolute conclusions, right? If we think back to Leith and back to rhetoric, Leith talks about how rhetoric, how argument is probability and not proof absolute. So what that means is these things should happen or they could happen, but we're not mathematicians, right? It is not our job as redders, right, to say what definitely will happen. It's our job to gather evidence, to analyze, to think critically, to consider what could happen, what most likely will happen based on what we do, right? So causal arguments are often open to criticisms or charges of false causality, right? Think about the vaccine and autism link. And really, if we go all the way back to the start of the documenting of autism as a disorder, then we see, right, how this problematic link came about. If we think back to the mid-20th century, the term autism did not exist until roughly the 1960s. It didn't exist. The polio epidemic and various disease epidemics of the mid-20th century led to a spike in the use of vaccines because people, particularly children, were dying of any number of curable communicable diseases like polio, like measles, like whooping cough, etc. So if you look at history, right, what happens is that at the same time that researchers are looking at this developmental disorder of autism, right, this really, I don't want to call it a disorder, this neurodiverse way of approaching the world and giving it a name, is the exact same time that vaccines are beginning to be developed and mass produced to inoculate children against deadly diseases. So in other words, the definition, the word comes about roughly the same time as the vaccine thing is happening, but one does not cause the other, if you understand what I'm saying. So then you have this very flawed research in the late 80s, early 90s. One piece of research that has since been thoroughly debunked by study after study after study. The person who does this original research loses his medical license. And this guy says that vaccines cause autism, right? But after saying that, because of the danger and the harm that this medical professional has caused, he's lost his license, right? And his theories have been debunked. So when we talk about, you know, false causality, that's what we're talking about. Just because two things happen at roughly the same time does not mean that one causes the other. In a previous video, I talked about Britney Spears' song Work Bitch, and then how after the song Work Bitch came out, unemployment rates dropped. People weren't going back to work because they were inspired by Britney Spears' song. I mean, maybe like a few people, right? But not the overall, you know, American public. So just because two things happen at the same time does not mean one causes the other. And it's really dangerous to get into that line of thinking, right? Because then we get into false causality, and then we can criticize faulty causal arguments. So in order to demonstrate that A caused B, find the strongest possible evidence and subject it to the most scrutiny, okay? Because again, causal arguments are most effective when it's not just like an A to B, right? But when we start to see complexity in causes, complexity of effects, right? Multiple things, not just a one-to-one sort of bridge, right? So keep that in mind. When we're developing causal arguments, we should explore possible claims, right? Often your early assumptions might be undermined by the facts you actually uncover. And again, like if I've belabored the point with that autism vaccine link, but that's, you know, a great example of this. Another one you can see in this comic here, right? Like a new study found Colorado has the lowest obesity level of any state. You know what that means? No, what? Forget dieting, we're moving to Colorado, right? Like that's just because you assume, just because you find out that Colorado has the lowest obesity, and you assume that if you move there, you're just going to automatically not be obese anymore. You're going to be in for a rude awakening, right? And I think, let's see, how many more do we have? We have 2 more slides after this. Oop. This is the one that I mentioned that is very like information heavy. So if you need to pause while I'm describing these, please go for it. So we have different definitions when relating to causal arguments. The first one is sufficient cause, which is there's cause enough for something to occur on its own, like breathing, right? We don't think about, oh, I've got to breathe, right? Like, I mean, sometimes I do because I'm like an airhead, but we don't have to think about it. It's just sufficient cause. It just happens, right? We do it without having to think about it. Then we have necessary cause, right? That's required for something to occur, but in combination with other factors. An example is like fire needs fuel, right? So in other words, I need some sort of fuel to ignite a fire, whether it's, you know, the tip of a match or gasoline or hairspray or a Molotov cocktail or whatever. But I also need ignition, right? I need some sort of spark to light those, right? 2 rocks together or whatever. So that's necessary cause, right? If I want to start this fire, if I got these, you know, if I have this match, I need to make sure it's got the sulfur on the end of it, but I also need to make sure I have something to strike it against, right? Then we have precipitating cause. Precipitating cause brings on a change, right? So like if we have a protest march, that could lead to a worker strike, which could lead to workers getting the benefits they deserve from a particular company or district, which could lead to, you know, equitable pay for the workers, right? So that they can live their lives and do their work without the, you know, without the financial struggle of being underpaid, right? Then we have approximate cause. An approximate cause is the immediately present or visible cause of action is the cause, right? So losing money in one area of your business leads to neglect in another area. I worked in restaurants for a long time, and my ex-husband was an executive chef. So I know a lot about like the restaurant industry. And so one way I always like to talk about proximate cause is like, you know, if your food's great, right? If your bar program is great, but your staff, your service is not that great, that problem in service is going to eventually cause problems with the bar program, with, you know, the amount of food that goes out, right? And that kind of leads us to remote cause, which is an indirect or underlying explanation for an action. Losing money in one area of your business leads to neglect kind of further along the way in another area. So the proximate cause would be like, you know, the food's great, but the servers are horrible at their jobs. You know, they take forever, they're rude to the customers, whatever. So then the proximate cause would be less people are ordering food because of the servers, right? Even though the food's great, fewer people are ordering food because they don't want to deal with the servers. Well, then the remote cause would then be something like, if the food's great, we're spending a lot of money on this great food, right? Then we have these servers that aren't that great. So people aren't buying the food. And so if people aren't buying the food, there's less money coming into the restaurant to buy the expensive food, to buy the expensive products, ingredients to make the expensive food. So then we start losing money in the ingredients. And then let's say we start skimming off the top and using cheaper ingredients. Then the quality of the food goes down. Well, if the quality of food goes down and the level of service goes down, and we're already losing money because fewer people are coming in, we're going to lose even more money, because then people are going to start saying, well, the food sucks, the service sucks, this used to be a cool place, but now I don't want to go here anymore. And then your doors eventually close because you're not making enough money, right? So that's more of a, the bad service to the closing of the doors becomes more of a remote cause then. In other words, it's less directly related, but it sort of does catalyze all these other factors for this to happen, for this remote effect to happen. And then we have reciprocal cause, which is one factor leads to another, which reinforces the first, creating a cycle, right? If you live in a neighborhood where there is a lack of access to good schools, the odds are that neighborhood probably has a level of poverty, because school success is because of taxes and systems, government systems. School success is inextricably linked to poverty, right? The poorer the neighborhood, the less effective the schools generally, right? And so if that happens, right, you're living in a poor neighborhood, you're not going to great schools, you don't get a great education, which means you are less likely to go to college in a way that is going to further your career, which leads to fewer educational opportunities, not just getting into college, but then further career opportunities. Then you stay in that poor neighborhood because you could never get out of that level of education. You could never get to the university. You can never get the job you want. You end up staying in the neighborhood. You have kids. Your kids go to those same underfunded schools, right? And they continue the cycle, right? Another one is the cycle of domestic abuse, right? Let's say you're in a relationship with someone. So you start out kind of in the calm, of a new relationship, but then tensions start to build, right? And there's, issues of control and abuse and all of these things. They start to build to a sort of major incident or a series of major incidents, perhaps, that could be in the form of verbal abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, and then physical abuse, maybe major physical abuse, hospitalization, restraining orders, things like that, right? But then the abuser does not want to leave the relationship. The victim is afraid to leave the relationship. And so then there's some sort of resolution where there's a honeymoon or reconciliation phase. Things go back to calm, but then the cycle begins over and over again until someone leaves this abusive relationship. And often getting out of that sort of reciprocal cause relationship is very difficult, right? Because things become so embedded, so systemic, so merged and submerged, right? That it's really difficult to get out of. So keep that in mind, right? Again, these causal relationships that we're talking about can have these very severe effects depending on what the issue is. And then finally, when you're presenting a causal argument, how do you support it? Well, first you show that the causes and effects you've presented are highly probable and backed by sufficient evidence, right? Not stuff you get off of Google. Always assess the links between cause and effect, because just like a bad link on a bike chain, you know, your bike's going to get stolen if you got a bad link on a bike chain. Trust me, I live in Long Beach. It's like the capital city of stolen bikes. In the same way, if you've got a bad link in the chain in your causal argument, it's going to fall apart, right? It's going to get lost. So you need to show that your explanations of any causal chains are accurate and identify where they could be broken down, right? We might still be able to weld this together and fix it, right? If we address that. Just like in your argument, if you address where the links are shoddy, you can fix them as long as you anticipate that. And then finally, show that other plausible theories of cause and effect are not being ignored. You have to show the other side. But again, you always have to talk about even you know, given the other side, even given where you have to anticipate where your argument might be a little shoddy, you know, you always have to come back to why your causal argument is the most preferable in terms of a possible outcome, right? Not a definite outcome, but a possible outcome. So I hope this was all incredibly helpful. I know there's a lot of information here, but hopefully you will see why, you know, causal arguments are important. So I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you in cyberspace. Have a great one. All right. Bye.